What we're going to do today is we're going to take about 30 minutes and run through some very critical action items for agents and small business owners. We're going to allow some time for questions and answers. So we encourage you to use the control panel for GoToWebinar on the right-hand side of your screen. There should be a pane that says questions. Our staff will be monitoring this pane, and we encourage you to submit questions as we go through the webinar. We'll compile those and make sure your questions are answered either within the 10 to 15 minute Q&A session we have at the end, or answered as a follow-up to the webinar, but we'll try to get to all of them. Just as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. It will be sent out post-webinar with the presentation as a follow-up. And again, we encourage you to ask questions. We have a poll question a little ways into the webinar. We encourage you to respond to that as well. So this is being brought to you today by ACT, the Agents Council for Technology. Just very quickly, ACT brings together volunteers from carriers, vendors, agents.
Hello.
I think we lost Ron.
Is he gone?
I don't know.
Oh, Bill, is that you?
Yeah.
There you go. You're back.
All right.
You're back.
And
you were talking and you were gone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we are back. I apologize if we had some drop-off. I'm not sure why that would have happened, but very quickly, we're recording today's meeting. We'll send it out with the follow-up materials. And at this point, I just want to introduce Bill Larson of NetGen Consulting and Paul Peoples of the Florida Association of Independent Agents, or of Insurance Agents, excuse me, also known as the FAIA. Bill and Paul are going to lead you guys through today's presentation, and at this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Bill. Go ahead, Bill.
Hey, thanks, Ron. Tell you what, Paul and I thought we would do this webinar like a little more of a conversational format, you know, such as an after-hours get-together, because really, this webinar is designed to get you acquainted with your requirements, again, under the existing laws and agency contracts for the data privacy and security, and to get you acquainted with really CyberGuide 1.0, which will be the basis for building this program for you. So we will go much deeper into how you can get into compliance in the next webinar. But again, this webinar is just to get you to understand what your requirements are under the existing laws and get you to the ACT website to familiarize yourself with CyberGuide 1.0. So today we'll begin with 3 simple steps to make your agency cyber secure and compliant. First, using the ACT Agency CyberGuide 1.0, then a written agency cybersecurity policy, and ultimately your call to action in developing and using your policy. So we will refer to these as step 1, step 2, step 3. Okay, next. Okay, since this webinar revolves around using CyberGuide 1.0 to help agencies begin to develop a written cybersecurity policy, and then again, how to implement each of these items in the cybersecurity policy in your agency, our poll question is, do you have a WISP written information security plan? Okay, Paul, would you like to comment on that? What you're doing with Florida and how you've developed that WISP?
Yeah, while everybody's taking the poll, a WISP, you know, acronyms in our industry sometimes you can shoot us in the foot. The WISP, a written information security plan, or the other term would be a written information security policy. The cybersecurity policy is basically the policy, and that's a policy that, you know, ACT has developed that you could actually fill in the blanks on. But if you did look at that policy when you get on the site, part of it is creating an actual implementation of the elements in that policy. And what that means is okay, this is a living document that you get up on in your office about, you know, who's responsible, who, you know, details about your network. A lot more than just saying, hey, we're going to protect your data, hey, we're going to do this with your data. It's more like remediation after the fact of a possible breach. In Florida, what we did was, our members, they were burdened with a requirement from a carrier in Florida, a signed risk carrier, to have what you would call a written information security plan, and then they gave a grid for the agents. And in there's a lot of things that are just outside the purview of our agents. And so we look to, partner with somebody that you can lean on and become a strategic partner to help our members. So we found a company called Bind IT that helped develop those kind of scenarios for our members. So it is important to know that it is a policy and a plan as well. Next.
Okay. Did we have our response from our poll question?
Yep. Ron, bring that back up. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. Just wanted to catch that real quick.
Yeah, I do too.
Okay, so
43% do not. Those of you that are unsure, this would be something that would be in place in your organization that it defines what you do with, personal information, security breach issues, and things like that, which may help you answer that question a little bit better. But we anticipated, somewhere around at least 50% not having this plan in place.
Okay, super. Well, let's go to the next slide then. Okay, just my question is, does this page scare you? It definitely would me if I didn't know how to deal with it. Let's just take a quick look at this for a second. Just look at those out there and what these are. These are requirements as outlined in the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. And this is a federal law which all agents must be in compliance with. And again, this is principally why the Act Agent Cyber Guide 1.0 was developed. And the idea was we wanted to develop this as a single source for agents in order to begin to understand and develop their data privacy programs as maintained by federal and state laws and, again, your company contracts. Well,
yeah, if you look at those three at the bottom there, security policy and procedures, back to what we said in the prior slide, staff training and monitoring pen testing, that would be like internal penetration testing on your network from inside and external penetration testing from the outside. And, not a lot of people in organizations have a chief security officer. So that would be your responsible party. And so, those things are very important. When we say staff training and monitoring, obviously on the protocols of how to protect data and stuff, but also things like phishing, where somebody that we do phish testing all the time on our employees, and that protects you from the internal aspect, because you can have the best firewalls in place and the best structure to eliminate them from coming inside, but it's like the Trojan horse. Once they're inside, you don't protect yourself from the inside going out. So yeah, this is a lot of scary stuff, and it's real important, and it's real, and it's only going to get worse. Next.
okay, as we look at, there we go. It's got the key laws in it. So as we look at this slide, it shows key laws, and these are the major laws for which agents must become compliant, depending if you sell either P&C or group health. So as we review this list of laws, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act is the law which affects most agents, and why Cyber Guide 1.0 was created, as we discussed. So we want to do this to help agents to begin their compliance process. Now, the first page of Cyber Guide 1.0 will outline 12 regulations as defined by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, and then gives you an overview of these major regulations. Now, next, under the regulations resource section, each regulation is more fully described, and there we have live links under the resource section to help you develop your actions for each regulation. So please use those live links. Next. On slide 6, we now have coming to our first step. So it's the first one we're going to do. We're going to review your state and federal cybersecurity laws. You need to do that. You need to go to Cyber Guide 1.0 and it has a link to show you the specific laws for each state. And you'll find this under number 3 in the regulations resource section under incident response plan. Now, the first bullet shows the link to the guidelines for each specific state. And this is under an item called Mintz 11 link. So if you link that on, that will bring up each state that you're in. The bulk of Cyber Guide 1.0 we've got discusses the Gramm-Leach-Pliley Act, as we discussed. It'll discuss the recommendations and how to use these guidelines to begin the compliance process for your agency. So, Paul, could you tell us about the work you've done with that in Florida and potentially some of the fines that you've seen with some of these laws?
Yeah, well, like I said, back to what we've done to help our members is to at least provide them a resource to help them create, their guidelines, their policies, their plans, remediation, response, all that stuff. But just to give you guys an example of what Florida's law states, okay, things that our Florida agents, and we have Florida agents on this call that probably would like to hear this, but any breach in Florida that affects more than 500 individuals, okay, has to within 30 days report this to the department, okay. And there's some mitigating factors that gives them maybe an additional 15 days, but they're required to a written notice, a synopsis of the events, number of individuals that were actually affected, a police report, copy of the policies in place regarding breaches. Wait, copy of your policy in place. So those 43% of you that said you don't have a policy in place, and you go in front of the court system and you don't have a policy in the event of some form of a breach, they're going to frown upon that pretty quickly. And then any steps that you've taken to rectify the breach. Now, these are part of your requirements. Okay, then you got to give a notice to each individual in the state who personal information was uncovered. Okay, and you don't have more than 30 days. Okay, so you've got 30 days to do that as well. After that, same thing. You got a written notice to them. Okay, now imagine if you had 20,000. So let's say you don't get to that in Florida. Well, after 30 days, it's $1,000 a day. And then after 30 days, it's $50,000 a month, and it can be fines up to $500,000. So additional requirements in Florida, if you have more than 1,000 individuals affected, now you have to actually notify all the reporting agency as well. Okay, so you can see in Florida, it's pretty stiff. And like I said, back to that one bullet that I told you about with the your policy in place. And this is, by the way, this is just fines. We're going to get into some other slides to talk about other costs and stuff, but these are just possible fines, and you only got 30 days. Like I said, maybe some mitigating factors, but that's about it. And that's Florida. So other states, that's why you have, the federal law is going to be the federal law, but you have to check your state, in which you reside. It could be stiffer than this, or it could be, the same or less. But we just changed in Florida. This just changed a couple of years ago, I believe, to make it a little stricter, for data breach.
Yeah, so again, what we've got, you need to make sure you're aware of the federal laws, which we're going to talk about with GLB, and each specific state law. So make sure you are aware of that and you can deal with those. Okay, next slide. Okay, now this gets into the facts. And again, most of the time we see facts about the number of cyber attacks, how this could put your agency out of business, and basically people seem to have just ignored this, or at least there seems to be a disconnect there in most agencies. I guess they seem to believe that they're never going to be attacked, therefore they don't need to bother with this. But in my opinion, the major reason that an agency wants to become compliant is simply that, one, it's the law, and this is restated in all of your agency company contracts. So I guess my question is, why would an agency want to expose itself to all the consequences for non-compliance for all these laws and contracts, say as Paul has talked about or we've talked about? So anyway, Paul, just kick it back to you for a second.
Yeah, you know, look at that there. It does 50% of small to medium-sized businesses suffered that in 2016. And you know that's growing. We watch it on the news every day. The other thing is, okay, so that's 50%. Of that 50%, 60% of them are going to go out of business in 6 months. So 60% of the 50% are going to fail because of certain scenarios. I mean, like I said, if you know your own cyber insurance policies, your policies in place, your testing and all that stuff, if you fail at some point in time and you have a massive data breach in your organization or one of your vendors, you know, there's other criteria too. It's not just you. If you rely on third parties to do certain things, that brings it into the mix too. You have a 60% chance of going out of business within 6 months because of the fines, the remediation, you know, everything that you have to do. And forget about that. After you actually, you know, report this to your customers, you just had a data breach in your system. Your credibility to them probably be questioned too. So it's a lot of moving parts there.
Yeah, and again, the reason for Cyber Guide 1.0. So yeah, if we could go on the next slide. Okay, so cost for non-compliance. Again, you often see studies that state costs for loss in small business experienced a data breach is, say, around $700,000, and may seem to be unbelievable in many cases, but to me, the real believable cost for the agency is threefold. First, you are disobeying a specific law, which opens you up to both state and federal penalties and fines. And just as Paul has discussed, these laws are then enforced by the State Department of Insurance and not someplace you want to be. Secondly, since it states that in your company contract, your agency will comply with all federal and state laws, this could result in loss of agency contracts and expose you to the liability as defined in those contracts. So this then gets to our third point, which is liability exposure in general and also in the agency for data loss. This could create a significant liability exposure for data loss incurred by your client. And forensically now, if your agency could be linked to a data loss, you can now potentially have a situation where you have an unlimited number of claims over an unlimited number of years. So since the stolen data is sold in the black market and the Social Security numbers can be resold forever, it never goes away. Unfortunately, never goes away, and you never get a new social number. So that creates a major problem. And now your cyber liability insurance policy, think about this. This is written on a claims-made basis, which means very simply your policy could be non-renewed, leaving your agency in a self-insured position with your assets exposed and potentially unlimited claims coming back in. So, Paul, with that being said, how'd you like to follow up on that?
You look at that. Just look at that's the cost for non-compliance. Okay, so if you recall, you know, we said, you know, 50% of businesses and then 60% will fail. So okay, you've either chosen right here. Okay, if you're going to be non-compliant at this point in time, you've got a juncture in the road. You're going to try to be compliant, obviously, or you're going to go out of business. Those are your choices. And so, and then that just adds to cost. And like you said, it's basically a function of, well, how many individuals are in your system that could have possibly been breached, other businesses and stuff like that, and then the cost of all those things in Florida that I just mentioned that you are responsible to do in the event of a data breach. So it's north of 690. You know, if you were not compliant, if you could be compliant, okay, and not be fined, you know, that is tough, but you're still going to have a large exposure of you know, financial resources needed to actually be compliant. So that's an average too. That was the average.
Yeah. So, and again, we keep beating this, but this is why it's critically important you get involved with Cyber Guide 1.0. So that will get us to our next slide, and that'll be our second step here. And we bring that slide up for second step. Anyway, I'll just go ahead. There we go. What we have, Cyber Guide 3 or Cyber Guide 1.0 is broken down into three sections. So first, the compliance and protection section roadmap, and this is a broad overview of the problems faced by the agents. So stating that agents need to make compliance a priority is back and forth all over this thing. And then what we've done is done a high-level overview of the GLBA security measure regulations, so at least we understand what we're talking about. Secondly, now, the costs and penalties for non-compliance, again, which we've just discussed. This also provides links to the U.S. National Cybersecurity Alliance, which this is where we found that 60% of small companies were unable to sustain their business after 6 months after a cyber attack, and the Ponemon Institute, which found that the average price for small businesses to recover after their businesses were hacked were the $690,000. So that just gives validity to where those numbers came from. Now, the third section of the guide, this is a review of the regulations and resources provided to help you begin your compliance process. Now, all of the regulations listed here are critical to comply with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This section will provide you with a much broader description of the regulations and show specific resources for your use. Next. The next section we'll get into is resources, and what we wanted to do here is review the specific resources in each section, because the resources, and again, extremely important, these are live links, and they will take you directly to the specific site to help you develop your program. So the intent here is to give you a number of resources to go to for specific information on each one of these regulations. So again, please, these are live links. Review each regulation and the resources listed behind them, again, as this will be a significant help in you developing the program. Next. That'll get us to our third step. And so now it's time to put our program together. First, what we do is review the federal and your state's cybersecurity laws. Then we use the critical action item link, which is shown here, as a way to introduce this to your agency. Now, this was a one-page overview, which Ron and I wrote for this specific purpose. This is a simple review of what CyberGuide 1.0 is, but it does it in a format which is much easier to discuss with your agency. Again, one page. This has live links to the guide and to the cybersecurity policy. Now then, once your agency has this ID in place, now we download the Cybersecurity Guide 1.0. And finally, we create an interactive cyber policy for your agency using CyberGuide 1.0 and the written cyber policy plan, which was provided. And also here, I'd like to review, or at least talk about the links in the appendix to CyberGuide 1.0, as it has some really great information which will help you in further understanding this process. It has links to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners recommendations, the New York regulations, and the last one that's in that section is entitled Gramm-Leach-Bliley Privacy Law for Producers. This is one of my favorites. This is from the Blue Ribbon Panel of the California Association. And what it does, it provides possibly one of the best overviews of why an agency must pay attention to and be in compliance with these laws. So if you'd like a shorter highlighted version, cliff notes, if you will, of this piece, let Ron or myself know and be happy to get that to you. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much, they're probably right now, that's a mouthful for everybody, but it is important to go back. There's a lot of assistance out there for you. You could reach out to ACT. If you're in Florida, reach out to me. I can, definitely help you with this. But the Cyber Guide 1.0 is a great starting step, and it's gonna evolve as this evolves. Just read through it. That'll at least take some of the angst out of your day-to-day. Because there's just a lot of information there. We spent a lot of time, going across different platforms to find, all the derivatives that are inside of this guide, as well as the, the cyber plan or cyber policy that you would have inside your office. So, I mean, I can't really say enough about these steps. This is basically a recap of all of the things that we said, and this is a great starting point for you. And this is, like we said earlier on, this is a 30,000-foot view, and then hopefully in the future, we can come in and get more granular with some things as we hear your questions and see what the industry needs, to move forward.
Okay, and then the next page, what we did is just compiled some resources, so you didn't have to go all the way back through the webinar. So this is a list of the resources and the links provided on those. Paul, thoughts on that?
Yeah, that every link that we put in here is in there. So and then like you said earlier, inside those documents, and you do need your credentials to log into the national site to download the template, the cyber policy template. So you just when you go there, just make sure you have your credentials to log in. And you'll be able to open up a Word doc and then save it down and modify it as you need. But once again, that's a policy and not necessarily a plan. Okay, just so you know that.
Okay, and our next slide basically says, do you need more help? So, hopefully we can be of help on this. Hopefully Cyber Guide 1.0 is your beginning point. But again, stay tuned, because now our next step will be go into much greater depth in our next cybersecurity webinars and helping you develop this. So, Paul, thoughts on that?
No, that's our next steps are to design things based on what we hear, in the questions and what comes up.
Okay, and then questions, that leads us into our last slide, which is questions. So hopefully we have some questions.
We do, Paul and Bill. We've got a number of questions that we've kind of been going through. Some are statements. I think we had a couple questions that talked a little bit about, half of the small businesses out there will have a data breach. 60% of those will have the opportunity or will be liable to fail. Kind of questioning whether that was factual or not, and I think we covered that with the Ponemon Institute data. So thank you for pointing that out. One of the questions that came out has to do with the size of an agency and compliance to these regulations. And I'm paraphrasing the question, guys, but does it matter? Does the size of the agency employees determine whether you have to comply with all of these regulations? And I know the New York DFS regulations apply to any business doing business in the state of New York. They don't have to be domiciled there. They just have to do business in the state of New York. And there are some criteria, exemptions for 10 employees or less, a certain amount of annual income or less, where they can be exempt from some of the New York DFS regulations. But guys, you want to talk to a little bit about the urgency to comply with the regulations that are listed in the Cyber Guide 1.0, please?
Yeah, that's why I brought up that IIABA Cal piece, because that was done for their blue ribbon panels. So that's probably as good as it's going to get. And what they did there is they defined very specifically who had to be doing this, why it had to be done, and basically every agency needs to comply with GLB. Now, what happens is that each state, each state has to use GLB as a floor, then they can expand beyond GLB, but the requirements under GLB are mandatory for every agency. Then you expand that beyond your state. Does that help answer that?
That does. Let's talk about timelines for compliance. We've got a couple questions on, is there a timeline for agents to be in compliance? Well, for New York DFS, that was this fall. But when it comes to Graham-Leach-Bliley, it's pretty much immediate for any agency. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, actually, GLB has been out there for a number of years. Yeah. And so, yeah, no, if, let's say, Paul and I had an agency and we didn't do these things, and somebody in the Department of Insurance came in, did an audit, and we didn't have any of these things in place, and specifically GLB, we have some serious problems. But to answer the question, no, GLB is in place now. It is active and must be complied with now.
And my apologies to those on this webinar that are watching me scroll through a bunch of screens. There was a question as to where the state-specific laws are for compliance. And I'm going back to the Agency Cyber Guide 1.0. Under number 3, Incident Response Plan, there's a live link there for the Mintz-Levin data breach guidelines. And for those on this webinar, that will list for every state, not only the state regulation, but also, and I'm just pulling up the very first state here, it'll talk about what's covered, what entities are covered, the procedures for notification during a data breach, if there are any encryption or safe harbor rules in place, and as important as anything, the potential penalties, which can vary by state. Is that correct, Bill and Paul?
Yeah, exactly.
I was just scrolling through some of these other questions too. I saw a question on, who's responsible to write your WISP, and basically there's no one person it's put on. Typically, in a large organization, it would be headed up by your CIO and your senior staff, and then you either if you have the wherewithal of the staff to do that, and you develop it. There are some guidelines out there. So what should be in that, and then there's no one person I would think that's responsible. It just has to be in place. The other question I said I saw, and I think it is is there a size limit? I don't know the answer to that. I think it doesn't really matter. Obviously, like if you have less than, if it's by employee count or if it's by policy count. So everything I've read, you're just responsible. It's just like PCI compliance. If you take one credit card, you're required to be PCI compliant. Period. So
yeah. So just to restate that. Yeah. Every agency must be compliant with GLB as a floor, and then the states will add beyond that, but GLB is the floor.
There was another question about auditing firms that an agency can hire with cybersecurity laws, right? In Florida, that's what we did. We went out and found one. Feel free to email me, and I can probably send you in the right direction. Another question is was this webinar put together to actually sell a product? No, it's actually get you acquainted with these laws and help you, because you're going to be required anyways. The purpose of ACT is to basically help our member agencies as these things come up to move forward in the right direction. And we don't have a dog in the hunt or anything. It's what we're right. Do to help you.
Yeah, and the one thing out there, and we tried to address this, but I'd like to say that again, is that there's been so much misinformation out there that it was very difficult for an agency to find out where to go. So the idea was, let's put something in one spot, make it easier for the agency to begin this process, and that's really how ACT Cyber Guide 1.0 came to be.
There's another question. How can we watch this? It's being recorded, and it will be put up, right, Ron? It will be put up in the webinar section at IIBA site?
That is correct. We're recording it. We'll convert it to MP4. We'll send it out with with this presentation, with the live links to everything post-webinar. And one thing I wanted to leverage off or extend off that Paul and Bill, both of you responded to the question, are we trying to sell anything here? What ACT does is creates resources like this free for Big I independent agents, and it's because of our work group, specifically the security issues work group, of which Paul and Bill are a part, that is comprised of volunteers from carriers, vendors, and agents who all take off their selling hats. They take off their business hats and come together to create a composite resource like this Cyber Guide 1.0. There are resources listed for each of those regulations. Some of them are free. Some of them are like the ACT Cybersecurity Policy template that Paul was talking about, where you can download and brand as an agency, fill in the blanks. There's more work to it than that, but it's much quicker to comply. And some of the resources that we list are, there may be a cost for, but we point to what we feel in agreement are the best industry resources. Now, a question came, several questions again were, you know, the $700,000 total cost seems out of line. I've Googled a few things. I'm getting stuff all over the place. That's the nature of statistics. We chose the institutions that we felt were the most dependable and worthy. Is it going to vary from small business A to small business B to small business C, the total cost for a breach? Yes. But we want to put out some information that we feel is the most consistent and trustworthy.
Actually, that's a U.S. cost too. If they took the international cost, it's higher.
Right. Guys, any of the other questions that you see that you want to respond to that we haven't covered?
Most of them. I mean, I don't see any more coming in. So.
No, it's a good. I'd just like to maybe make one comment on this. You know, if the agents would go in and utilize CyberGuide 1.0, this will get them obviously in compliance. But what I also see out there is a lot of times you'll see an agency that says, "Oh, I've got to be protected from a breach. I'll go out and I'll hire a company to make sure that, you know, my links are good, et cetera, et cetera." Okay, that to me is you've not built the foundation. What you're doing is you're building the house on sand. At that, if you would go back in, do CyberGuide 1.0, do all the basics in there, then one, you're compliant, and two, it will protect your agency significantly from a breach. Then if you want to go out and bring somebody in to put the nuts and bolts on the rest of it, then you're good. But again, CyberGuide 1.0 has many, many uses, and hopefully the agents will avail themselves of this.
All right, what we're going to do now is wrap up a little bit. Again, we do have many live links, as Bill and Paul have said, to these resources. And if you go to the ACT website, we're all off the independentagent.com main website, the Big I main website. Independentagent.com /ACT is our main website, and ACT Cyber Guide gets you to obviously to the agency Cyber Guide 1.0 and some other resources. There are other resources on the Big I that ACT can point you to as well. One is the Big I Markets, a for-profit division of the Big I that has some really in-depth resources for cyber liability policies, something that Paul was talking about a little bit earlier. So we'd encourage you to check that out as well. So on behalf of the Big I staff and ACT staff, I want to thank Bill Larson and Paul Peoples. Thank you guys so much for leading us through this. Thank you everyone for attending, and I'm going to reiterate one more time, there will be more webinars that we're going to do on this specific subject. We'll take this high-level overview that we fit into 30 minutes, and we'll start to break it out in sections, more expanded sections. So you'll be hearing more about those free webinars soon. So again, thanks to Paul and Bill. Thanks to everyone for attending, and happy holidays.
Take care, guys.